Do you have a digital camera that's always on the auto mode? Trust me, you're not alone. So many people spend hundreds and even thousands of dollars on their camera gear only to never get off the auto mode. Or even worse, they just leave their expensive camera at home because they don't know how to use it properly. But you don't need to be one of those people. So in this video, I'll share with you the 2 camera modes that you should use instead of the auto mode for much greater creative control. If you look at your camera, you'll most likely see a dial with several shooting modes, each with an icon next to it. But the truth is, to get the creative control that you want with your photography, you only really need to know about 2 modes. Aperture priority, which is marked with the letters A or AV, and shutter priority, which is marked with the letters S or TV. Over time, you might want to master the manual mode too, which is marked with the letter M, but for now it's definitely not a must. So in this video, we'll cover the 2 most widely used camera modes, aperture priority and shutter priority. We'll go through each of these 2 modes to understand what they do and when you should use them. We'll start with aperture priority because most pros who need to photograph quickly use this mode to take the majority of their photos. One of the most popular reasons that you would use aperture priority is to control how much soft, beautiful background blur your photos have. I'll ask my videographer to adjust the aperture of the video camera to illustrate what I mean. At this point, I am nice and sharp, but everything in the background has a pleasing soft blur. How much background blur you'll have is determined by something called an f-stop number. The lower the f-stop number, the more background blur there will be. The higher the f-stop number, the less background blur your photos will have. Right now the f-stop number is low, and there's a lot of background blur. If my videographer changes to a higher f-stop number, increasing to f8, then f11, and finally f16, the beautiful background blur diminishes until it is almost completely gone. Okay, so now we're going to shift back to a low f-stop number and the background blur effect has returned. The effect is better for portraiture because it sort of brings all the attention to the main subject, which is the face. But you don't need to use this effect for only portrait photography. Adding background blur can also improve your nature, product, food, and still life photos. I'd like to show you how to access aperture priority right now. Normally, most camera bodies will have the MSAP dial. And what I'd like you to do is switch to A. That signifies aperture priority. Some cameras, it'll be AV. Now, when you switch to A or AV, you should be able to rotate the dial, or sometimes it's like a joystick. And can you see how the aperture is changing? We are now increasing the f-stop numbers, which is giving us a lot more focus sharpness and less background blur in our picture. Now there are 2 things that we're concerned with when we have a retro styled camera such as this Fujifilm. When you're dealing with your dial that has all of the shutter speeds, I'd like you to switch to A. That would be above the fastest shutter speed. What this does is it initiates aperture priority. Now the next thing we have to do, it's very important, if your aperture ring, if you have one, is on A, I need you to turn it to a physical number. You can choose any f-stop that you want and you will be in aperture priority mode as long as you have the A up on your shutter speed dial. Okay, so we're in aperture priority. The f-stop number is at the lowest possible, which is f2.8. I'd like to do an experiment with you. Okay, let's take a test shot here, and you see how the trees are nice and sharp above my camera, but the wonderful Mexican building behind is out of focus. Let's do some test shots. We're gonna go from f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, and finally the highest f-stop number, which is f22 for my lens. And now let's put these pictures side by side. The first one has a really nice amount of blur in the background, but you don't always want to have background blur in your photos. If you want your photo to have focus sharpness throughout the picture space, use a higher f-stop number. F8, F11 or greater will give you Nice focus sharpness in the foreground and the background of the image. A higher f-stop number is great for landscape, cityscape, and architectural photography where you want to clearly show the entire scene. Keep in mind that you'll probably need to use a tripod when you increase your f-stop number past f8, depending on how much light is in your scene. To sum up, use aperture priority to control how much background blur your photos will have. With low f-stop numbers, you will have a certain amount of background blur. With higher f-stop numbers, there will be less and less background blur. What this means is that your entire picture space, the foreground and the background, will progressively have more focus sharpness as your f-stop numbers get higher and higher. Another popular mode is shutter priority. You can use shutter priority mode to control what's called motion blur. Motion blur is when a moving subject is not clearly defined in a photo, like in this case where the people are slightly blurred but the background is perfectly sharp. Every camera has a shutter. It's either a physical or electronic element of the camera that opens for a while, lets some light in, and then closes again to stop the light from entering. The faster the shutter speed, the quicker the shutter opens and closes. When a camera's shutter opens and closes very fast, there is no motion blur. When the shutter is slower to open and close, motion blur starts to appear. And it makes sense. The longer the shutter is open, the more time your subjects have to move around within your composition, which results in varying degrees of motion blur. So, when is shutter priority useful? Whenever motion is involved. It can be moving kids or animals. It can be fast-moving cars or motorcycles. It can even be water that's moving. If you want your subject to be perfectly sharp, use a fast shutter speed. If you want to have some motion blur or motion smoothness in your image, use a slower shutter speed. So, shutter priority means that I'm telling the camera what shutter speed to use, and the camera decides what the appropriate aperture f-stop number should be. Let me show you what I mean. I want to photograph colorful San Miguel de Allende vehicles at a really low angle with 3 different shutter speeds. So for this Fujifilm, all you need to do is make sure that you have your shutter speed dial on a number. Just make sure it's not on an A. Also, with regards to the actual f-stop numbers on the aperture ring on your lens, please go to the letter A. Make sure you're not on a physical number. This will make sure that you're in shutter priority mode. Okay, now what if you have a more common camera body that has the MSAP top dial? Well, it's very simple. Just go to the letter S for shutter priority, or if you're a Canon user, you would be going to TV. Next, you can actually change your shutter speed by moving either your thumb dial or your top dial or a finger dial, or in some cases even a joystick on the back of the camera. And this will allow you to actually adjust the shutter speeds that you can see on the back LCD screen of your camera. Okay, now that I'm in shutter priority mode, I will select a shutter speed of 1/500 for my first test shot. This means that the shutter will be open for 1/500th of a second. This is very fast. Let me give you an example. Okay, I was hoping to get one of these great green taxis, and I did. So as you can see, the taxi is perfectly sharp because of the very fast shutter speed. Now, what if we change to 1/30th of a second? That would be 1/30. Let's take a test shot and see what happens to the vehicle. Okay, I was really happy with that shot because I got a motorcyclist and I have a really cool blur. It's actually exactly what I wanted. Okay, now let's try 1 full second, which is a long time for your shutter to be open. Okay, another green taxi. Now at this time, with the shutter speed of 1 second, I can't even tell it's a car actually. Now we do know it's a car because of those great headlights. So even though you could argue that this is an unusable picture, for artistic reasons, 1 second is actually really good. Okay, let's pull up these 3 pictures. Now, the 1/500 shutter speed is very fast. The car is perfectly still. 1/30th is sort of middle ground. When there's a moving object, you're going to get a little bit of artistic motion blur. That's great. Make sure you use a tripod. Now, when you're at 1 second, you're going to have extreme blur, which can either completely ruin your picture, or for artistic effect, it can actually look pretty cool, especially at dusk when you have the headlights of the car. The headlights or the taillights are going to create amazing motion blur. Now, there's so much more I'd like to tell you about digital photography. And while I didn't hold anything back, there's only so much I could share with you in such a short video. And that's why I've recorded an entire video course about taking incredible photos with your digital camera. And in case you rely entirely on your camera's auto settings, this course will let you finally take your camera off of the auto mode. So if you'd like to find out more about my digital photography course, you'll find more information right under this video. So take a look at my full digital photography course, and I hope to see you there.